Good morning. I've had the A7S for about 4 weeks now, and I've been putting it through its paces. And I just wanted to make a video about some of the things that I like and some of the things that are what I would consider to be challenges. It's worth noting that, the challenges this camera has are no different than any other camera has. I had a Blackmagic Cinema camera for 5 years, and it took a long time for me to understand its quirks and how it worked in different lighting conditions. So if I could say one thing about this camera, I would say it's not a camera that you can just pick up and start shooting with. You might be able to if you're an advanced user, but if you're new to making video, especially video, it takes some time to understand this camera and all its little nuances and all the things that it's capable of. So it's a great camera, but it's not without its issues that you have to work through. And some of the issues that it has actually make sense. So the first thing I have to say I like about the camera is the fact that where the controls are placed. I noticed right away it was very easy for me. There's three dials on the camera. One dial, the back dial, for instance, controls the ISO, and then the other two dials control the shutter speed and the aperture. So it's very easy to make manual adjustments with this camera. It's very well laid out. The other thing that I really like about it is it's very easy to get critical focus. The viewfinder on this thing is fantastic. It's got a 5-stop meter inside, so you can see, you can double check your exposure, but you can absolutely nail focus with this camera. It's one of the most fantastic focusing systems I've ever seen. As soon as you touch the dial to get your manual focus, it automatically zooms in, so you can get a really nice focus. And of course, the big selling feature of this camera is that it's low light sensitivity. It's sensitivity to light. And if you think about that, it's really interesting in a way, because its greatest strength, in a sense, is its greatest weakness. So if you think about it, well, yeah, it's sensitive to light. It's great in a dark room. It's great at night. It's great in a cave. But if it's sensitive to low light, then it's also extremely sensitive to bright light. So the downfall of this camera, or the challenges this camera presents, I would say, are with bright lights, highlights, and then also, and that kind of relates to exposure. And then also, one of the problems with this camera is the rolling shutter is a little worse, is a little more pronounced on this camera than other cameras. So if you've dealt with rolling shutter in the past, you know you have to make your movements very smooth and gentle and slow, and then you have to sometimes adjust the angle that you're shooting a moving subject at. Motion blur will help hide sometimes the rolling shutter. A lot of people don't usually do whip pans, except maybe in an action movie. But if you thought you had to be careful with that on a DSLR, with this camera, it's even more pronounced. There is the possibility to, and every problem that I mentioned, there is a solution to it. So the great things are the controls. It's user friendly, the low light ability, and the viewfinder optics and display are fantastic. And focus is, of course, one of the most critical things of all. So this camera has all those things nailed. The issues and concern really is proper exposure. It can be a challenge to get proper exposure, even with the three tools that come with the camera. So the camera comes with a exposure meter, it comes with a histogram display, and it also comes with the zebra stripes. So with those, even with those three tools, it's very, very easy to blow out your highlights with this camera. And so that's what I would say is the number one issue with this camera, is dealing with the highlights. So it deals with the low lights, you could say, but how it deals with the highlights is another issue. And these issues are not necessarily deal breakers, but you need to be aware of them. The main issue, really the main issue with this camera, is that you cannot let your highlights clip, period. So number one, you need to be aware of your highlights in the first place. And there is an app I'll do a video about called the Cinemeter 2 that can really help with that, by using a false color function and immediately identifying hotspots. And so you'd think if you're, normally into filmmaking, you're already kind of aware of where highlights and where they are. But with some cameras, it seems like they never really blew out the highlights like this camera does. And the other thing is that when you bring the highlights down in camera, then you can actually underexpose your subject, and then when you try to bring that subject back up in post, you're actually introducing noise. So a lot of it depends on the scene you're shooting and what your subject is. So if you have a subject and there's an actor, let's say, and then there's highlights in the background, and you say, well, I'm going to drop those highlights down and then boost it up in post, you could end up introducing noise, and then that's its own separate problem. So anyway, once you are aware of your highlights, you do have a few choices. So the first choice is, of course, avoid them altogether. So if you're shooting a scene and there are highlights, recompose the shot so the highlights are not in the way. That's it's almost like dealing with aliasing and moire. If you have something that's aliasing, you've got to get it out of your shot. I'm not aware of any way of getting rid of that in post. I think you can try to blur it sometimes, but that doesn't always look good. Number two is if you got highlights in your scene, you can dim or block them out. You can use a graduated ND filter or put a flag or scrim over the offending highlight. That's a good option if you have those tools available and it's practical in that situation. And then the third option is to expose to the highlight in your scene. But then, like I mentioned earlier, this might underexpose your primary subject. Solution number one is probably the best, I would say. If you have a highlight in your scene, get rid of it. And number two, if you have the tools like an ND filter or a flag or a scrim, I would put those in front of the highlight so that it's not a highlight anymore. And then exposed to the highlight is a possibility, but then that raises the prospect that you're going to underexpose your subject and then have to. I should say with regard to that actually you could expose to the highlight, but then you need to bring in lights to get a proper exposure on your subject, and if you don't have lights to bring in, then you might underexpose your subject. So that's a problem. So another way to say all this is that while this camera is great in dark, in a cave, it's not so great in bright lights. But this makes sense because it is extremely sensitive to light. Like it's kind of like a person who can see in the dark, but then when you go outside, they're blinded by the light, and they need sunglasses. Uh, the second major issue I have, and I've seen this coming from the Blackmagic camera side, which had really great codecs. They had ProRes and DNX HD. The second major issue is the AVC codec in this camera is pretty good. It's a pretty good codec, but I would say that it does not hold up to heavy grading, and breaks down fairly easy. So if you're thinking like, well, I'm going to bring this footage into post, this flat washed out stuff, and just really pop everything back, it's possible, but you could also break down the image because this camera is not shooting in RAW. It's shooting in a compressed 8-bit, and if you're shooting in camera, then that's going to be a problem. Now I know some people record to an Atmos recorder or an external recorder, but that's to me that's another whole workaround that you've got to deal with. So we're just talking about here. I'm just talking about the camera as it is without any external recorder. And so you can grade the codec that shoots internally with this camera, but be aware that you can only push it so far. So what that means is that you need to get the good image in camera. You need to get the best image you can in camera with the idea that you're just going to modestly correct it in post. So try to get the best footage you can first. And the last thing about this camera I would say is that if you thought rolling shutter was bad on your previous DSLR, it is probably worse, maybe even 2 times worse on this camera. even though the APS-C mode can lessen it, it's pretty significant. So what this means is that you have to move the camera slowly and smoothly. Whip pans are out, fast pans are out, fast tilts are out, fast moving about with the camera is out. So that doesn't mean you can't film fast things. You just got to be aware that you could introduce rolling shutter and other artifacts depending on the direction the movement is coming from. So when it comes to bright lights and fast movement, you can have some problems with this camera. And there are solutions to each of the problems, but sometimes you might not like what the solution is. But to be completely fair, that's true with any camera. The Blackmagic camera has a problem with getting critical focus, and of course that's huge, right? So something being out of focus is the one thing that you really can't fix in post. So with the Blackmagic camera, you had the issue of dealing with that. You're on the Blackmagic camera, you just had to go off the LCD screen on the back, and there is no. And then in the daylight, you can't even see the LCD screen. But there are workarounds to that, But then again, that's that camera. So to summarize all this, I would say the Sony A7S is not a camera you can pick up and just start shooting with. Of course you can. I mean, you can of course grab it and start shooting, but what you're shooting, is it gonna be usable is another story. Are you gonna be able to grade it? Is it over? Are the highlights blown out and things like that? So this camera is fantastic in low light. If you're going to be shooting at night in a predominantly low lit scene, there's no question this is the camera that you would grab. But it is not so great with bright lights and unfortunately movement. So that's something to think about, right? It has excellent ergonomics and the focusing is fantastic, which is a huge, huge plus. It does have what's called S-Log, but I found that very difficult to work with, and it has a base ISO of 3200. Philip Bloom, who I respect quite a bit, shoots with Cine 4 picture profile and gamma curve, and then he uses the S gamut color mode. And I'm just getting ready to do a video about that, about those things. So hopefully, you check that video out later and see if that's good. But I can tell you right now with this camera, I'm definitely shooting in the Cines. That sounds weird to say, but and I've been doing most of my shooting with Cine 1 right now in the cinema color mode. But I have a funny feeling I'm going to end up where Philip Bloom is with Cine 4 and S Gamut. But if I could say one thing about this camera, and the one last thing about it is, this is not the kind of camera that you think I want to compare it to when I got a DJI Phantom Pro, and I thought, I came in the box and I'm gonna pull it out and just start shooting, and but what happened was it was just the opposite. It was like I spent like 3 days trying to figure out how the thing worked. There was all this app and Wi-Fi and I didn't have the latest firmware, and then it was days and days and days, and I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why I was thinking that I was just going to pick it up and start shooting, flying around with that thing, and this camera is no different. Like, you're going to need to spend, I would say, at least 2 or 3 weeks screwing around with it and taking test shots. And you can go online and listen to all these watch all these videos, but at the end of the day, you need to just come home and take the camera out yourself and suffer through the settings yourself, just like anyone else. Even though you can go online and get some ideas on and cheats and stuff, it really comes down to you taking the camera out and just seeing for yourself. And that's where I'm at, because I can't tell you what, I don't know what you think looks good, and what I think looks good, you may not think it looks good. So it's incredibly subjective. There are some technical issues, but where I'm at right now is I'm testing Cine 1 through 4 with the color mode on cinema or S-gamut. And then it's not just seeing how that looks in camera, but then how that footage also holds up in post. So just take that for example. So let's say you're gonna shoot you're gonna take your Sony A7S out and see which picture profile works for you. Well, there's, I don't know, there's, what is there, like 8 gamma curves, and then there's like 7 or 8 color modes. So that's 64 different combinations or more. So how long would that take to shoot 64 combinations? Well, you may not shoot every single combination, but you may know, like, oh, well, I'm not going to use the stills gamma curve. I'm not going to use the Rec 709 one, the ITU 709 one. It's too punchy for me. It's just a little over the top. You want some, and then maybe you want an image that's more gradable. So that narrows it down for you right there. But let's say you're just going to do the cine modes, and then let's say you've written off S-Log because it's just insane. So you're down to, let's say, cine 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then of those, which color modes do you like? Well, you could try Pro, which adds a little bit of more red to the skin tones. It brings out the skin tones a little bit more, I think. But then you basically have cinema color mode and S-gamut. So that's cine 1, 2, 3, 4, and then each one has either cinema or S-gamut color mode. So those are 8 different combinations of settings, and I can't tell you which one that you might like better than me, and this and that. So you can take that out and just take those 8 combinations, go out and find something that a scene where it goes from shadow to highlights, get the best exposure you can without blowing out the highlights, however you have to deal with your highlights, and then shoot that footage in camera, take it home, and look at it on your computer, and see which one of those 8 that you like the best. Then take those and put it into your favorite color correcting program, whether it's your existing nonlinear editor or DaVinci Resolve or Film Convert or whatever, and apply the settings to whatever look you like to that footage. Go back and look at the footage and see how much noise was introduced and how well did that image hold up to grading, the type of grading that you like to do. So you can see how long would that process take, just to go out and shoot something, maybe a couple hours it might take to do that, and then to download it, look at it, render it out, see what it looks like. You're talking 3 or 4 hours, and then if you want to grade it too, add on a couple more hours, and then you want to render it out and then look at it. You're talking about 6 or 8 hours just for that. But that's what you've got to do. And I mean, you could spend 6 or 8 hours just looking around the internet for what you might like to do, but that's what you got to do, because you've got to decide for yourself as a filmmaker, what look you like. And I can tell you what I like, and I can tell you what Philip Bloom likes, but that may not be what you like, and that may not be what holds up to correction with the tools you have, with the systems that you have. So you've just got to go out there and budget the time to do it. And is it fun? It sort of can be fun, but in a way it's kind of a pain in the ass, because you probably already have in mind what you want to shoot and you just want to get shooting. But this is the prep that you got to put in to learning to deal with this camera. So anyway, I hope you found this went on a little longer than I thought I did, but it's easier than filming a whole video. So I just thought I'm gonna do this as kind of a podcast thing. So I hope you found it helpful, and any comments, as long as they're not like wishing me death, are appreciated. Okay, take care, bye.